Good morning. Hello and welcome to this next lecture in the series of Knowledge Miles webinars, part of the Lord Mayor's lectures on behalf of Professor Michael Manelli, whose theme for this mayoral year is Connect to Prosper. In this series of online lectures, we address the connections in and around the square mile of the City of London, connections which can and are helping us to tackle the challenges facing the world today. I'm Dr. Kevin Parker, Director of KKI Associates and Science Advisor to ZN in the City of London. I'll be chairing this session and taking questions and answers afterwards. So our plan for today is this introduction, our keynote lecture from Professor Alex Murdoch, then approximately 20 minutes of questions and answers. You can ask questions online or by speaking if you're not shy. Briefly, just to introduce Professor Murdoch, he is Professor Emeritus at London South Bank University. He is a social business and third sector researcher with extensive professional knowledge and governance experience. He spent some 25 years teaching and research experience gained from associations with universities in the UK, the USA, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. He also has successful board level and organizational development and leadership experience, previously a professional and senior manager in the public sector. His research interests are cross-sector collaboration, partnership, citizen engagement and co-agendas, social impact measurement, food insecurity, social innovation, and issues of an aging dynamic. And the title of his talk is Taking a Positive Approach to an Older Dynamic Using Blue Zones and Evergreen Lenses.
Okay, I think that brings it to me, and welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining on this. I hope it's a sunny day. I'm sitting in fact, in a boat in Cherbourg, which is rather nice because I'm practicing what I preach, and I'm living an active, working and partly retired life. So this particular talk is going to go through a series of issues. Next slide, please. And I'm going to talk about the implications of an aging population, which has been seen in, shall I say, in a nuanced, if not negative fashion. It's seen as a threat and also as a challenge. I'm going to suggest that perhaps we should regard longevity as a dividend, and particularly it's often associated with continuing economic activity. I'm going to be looking at active and positive aging. I'm going to be touching on blue zones. Some of you may have seen the Netflix series about blue zones. And I'm going to be talking about an evergreen approach, which is an academic at the London Business School who has recently published on that matter, and I like the phrase evergreen. And so first of all, I think we're going to start off with an invitation for you to participate in a question. And so, Lucas, if you can present that, and I would ask you to pick on your preferred option there. You don't get a middle option, and I can see here it is. Oh, I like that. I like that. Looks like a lot of the people here may not need this particular lecture. It's looking like 80, 70, well, it's going up, 70, 21% versus, right, okay. Okay, so let's end the poll and share the results. Can we do that? Or whatever is the appropriate thing. Thank you. Okay, so if we can, you might remember the figures there. I noted them down. Let's see what happens towards the end. So let's move on to the next slide. And this is a very good friend of mine. And if you can, Lucas, if you can start the video going. This is my good friend James Twark in Colorado. And you can see he's coming down there on his snowboard. And coincidentally, the average age of the snowboarder at the time was 27 years. If you reverse the numbers, 72, that's how old Jim was at the time this video was taken. 4 years ago, and he's still snowboarding now. I was out with him earlier this year, and he was still snowboarding. So let's move on to the next slide, please. We can see changes in the age structure of the population. This, I would guess, is familiar to all of the, almost all, if not all, everybody, and then most people, and that is a projected increase in people, not just older people, but people who are described as particularly old. And in Japan, they have a word which says old person, then they say old. They repeat the word old to describe people who are significantly older, 80 plus. So we can see that this age structure is happening and coming through, and it's happening in not just in the UK, but in most Western countries, and indeed in a number of non-Western countries. Next slide, please. And this has often been seen as a negative one. The little uh, reverse pyramid on the left really sums it up, that you've got a reduced birth rate and older people living longer and longer, and you have this concept, rather negative concept perhaps of a small child supporting a massive set of parents, grandparents, and maybe even grandparents, and this is the way that it's often seen as an issue. The aging demographic, and particularly the change in the structure of a population, is seen as an issue. Next slide, please. This I would suggest two perceptions here. One is from Dylan Thomas, who I imagine most of you are familiar with. He wrote this when I think he was 21 years old, and this is his notion of aging. Don't go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rage at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. It's a pretty trenchant view of aging. On the left-hand side, though, you've got Confucius, who says, at 70, I could follow the dictates of my own heart, for what I desired no longer overstepped the boundaries of right. And in Norway, where I've worked, one of my Norwegian colleagues, when I became 70, says, you're in your best decade. And he said, you're in the 70s, your best decade, because you no longer have to worry about, generally about income or career, and your parents have probably sadly moved on, and so have your children. So you've acquired a degree of freedom, and I think that was a not inaccurate observation. Moving on, next slide, please. There's a particular concept of aging, and the conventional wisdom is that it's a challenge, that you're looking at the demands upon public services, and I won't go into dependency ratios, but I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with dependency ratios and the consequences, for employment of having a population demographic which is significantly older, and you haven't got a sort of a large young youth demographic coming through behind them. So that's, if you like, the conventional public policy wisdom that's been around for some time. Next slide, please. But it's not just about how long people live. It's about the number of years that you spend in healthy life as opposed to in poor health. And that's a particular issue. And Andrew Scott in Evergreen, looking at Evergreen generation, he says, well, it's not so much promoting uh, longevity in itself, but it's rather encouraging healthy life years, that the longer years you live in good health, the better it is. And I think we would all agree with that. And you can see there that the purple on the purple as opposed to the blue demonstrates the years in poor health, measured from in the lower bit from the age of 65. And they're a bit dated. I tried to find some more recent figures, but I couldn't find them very easily. But for a 65-year-old man, you can see that in 2009 to 11, 7.3 years of his post-65 life are currently spent in poor health. And that's a bit of a worrying statistic, is it not? Let's move on to the next slide, please. And this is just a very quick image. You can look at it afterwards, but these are just some of the books that I've been looking at. The one that's on the top left by Tom Kirkwood, in fact, was published, I think, around about 25 years ago. And Tom Kirkwood is a bit of a guru of aging, the science of human aging. And I would recommend, that you can buy it on Amazon or whatever, probably for pennies. It's been around a while, and it's a very readable book, which in fact, influenced me significantly. And those are the sorts of books. So you can see the longevity imperative, and the Changing Mind by David Levitin, and one interesting one is Jellyfish Age Backwards. But if you're interested in reading more, then that's a bit of literature for you. Next slide, please. One of the books there was Dan Buettner's concept of blue zones, and that's something that has really interested me. I visited one of the blue zones. I was visiting professor in Sardinia, and that was one of the areas of blue zones. And these are from the early 2000s. Dan Buettner got a National Geographic Fellowship to go and look at areas of the world where people seem to live long and healthy lives. And as you can see, the slide may not be very clear, but you can easily look it up. You can see the blue zones are there. There's Loma Linda in California, Costa Rica, there's Sardinia, Icaria in Greece, and Okinawa. So those are the sorts of areas that Mr. Buettner identified as blue zones, and there's a huge, online literature about diets and about exercise and all kinds of stuff, which has been influenced by the blue zones literature. So let's have a little bit more of a detailed look at it. Next slide, please. These are 9 lessons that are drawn from the blue zones literature, and all of them, I would say, probably for most of us, make sense. Daily, low intensity physical activity. Some of you may be doing the so-called 10,000 steps routine, where you go out and you have a step counter and you walk roughly maybe 4 or 5 kilometers. And that's one aspect of the blue zones is physical, low intensity, not so what I would describe as pounding weights at the gym or trying for marathons or whatever, but daily low intensity activity. There's the concept of reducing calorie intake, and here there's a lot of literature there that suggests that that you reduce your calorie intake, and it's a good thing for you. One of my friends said to me rather prosaically when he needed to reduce weight, he said, I do exercise, but you can't outrun a fork. And his concept was basically to reduce his food intake. And in reducing weight, that was pretty successful for him, though he did it fairly dramatically. A plant-based diet. That doesn't mean a plant-only diet. And for example, in some of the blue zones like Sardinia, fish and meat figure on the diet, but it's rather saying that plant-based is where you should be looking at rather than a meat-based diet. The fourth one there is a low or no alcohol intake, and I looked at this in some detail. I in fact stopped alcohol entirely for about 2 years. And then I went to Sardinia as a visiting professor and found that the Canino wine in Sardinia was considered and had been assessed as in moderation part of the Mediterranean diet that had been associated with longevity in Sardinia. So I now have a case of Canino wine in my cellar. But low or no alcohol intake is part of that. The fifth one I think is very significant. It's the concept of a life purpose, that people have a reason for getting up. I used to be chair of an organisation which was called Emmaus. I was chair of the South London Emmaus, and we used to take people in, who were homeless or came out of prison, and we ran a social business, and we described our mission as providing a bed and a reason to get out of it. In other words, we were described by some people as a homelessness charity. Well, that was half true, but the other half was that we provided a purpose and a meaning for people to get out of bed and to go and do stuff and work in the organization. The sixth one there is about reduction of stress, which I think is particularly important in stressful environments, which many of us have worked in, are not good for your health. A certain amount of stress is helpful, but excess stress is a real killer. The seventh one is engagement in some sort of spirituality or religion. And here, Dan Butner, I think, was particularly looking at Loma Linda in California, which was a Seventh-day Adventist community. And it's not suggesting that people should rush off and join a sect or a church, but rather that they should have some kind of spiritual dimension to their lives. And number 8, which I don't think many of us would disagree with, is making family a priority and focusing very much upon family and maintaining family ties. And the last one, which I think is really significant, is an active social life. And one of my former academic, Norina Hertz, commented that loneliness was the equivalent to smoking 10 or 15 cigarettes a day. So I think that I've gone into that in some detail, but you can look at the Blue Zones stuff. It's very easy to find. It's a lot of it online, and there's also a Netflix series as well. Can I have the next slide, please? What I looked at, which I don't think anyone has looked at really, is what Blue Zones don't have. And by and large, they don't have age-related retirement. So in all the Blue Zones areas, people just carry on. There isn't a cliff edge retirement. Even in Loma Linda in California, people keep working. The doctors and nurses there are working into their 80s, and even there's some doctors who are still working actively into their 90s. And part of Loma Linda is basically that you carry on. You don't simply cliff edge retire. Second aspect is geographic mobility, and this I think is one of the most interesting aspects which hasn't been really picked up. Dan Butner, when he first did this work, said, "Oh, it's great, I'll move to Sardinia." Well, in effect, the people in blue zones are there. People in blue zones are not very mobile. They are where they are. In Sardinia, people in Icaria, they stay put. In Costa Rica, by and large, they stay put. Loma Linda, they stay put. And geographic mobility is not really, they're not very mobile populations. They are where they are. And last thing is that they don't generally seem to have things like gyms or wellness industries. So the Blue Zone mantra is not about gym membership or subscribing to, the various wellness drugs and so on. They don't seem to have that. So those are the things Blue Zones tend not to have. Next slide, please. Will the UK have one? And this one is interesting. This is fairly recently from May, just a month ago or so. And it was proposed that South Hams in Devon has suggested it might be a blue zone. But that was based really, I think, on areas of retirement. And so you've got areas where, in effect, people who are healthy move to that area and retire. And there's a suggestion that they might be a blue zone. I'm not sure that I would buy into that concept of a blue zone simply based on the percentage of people who are elderly and apparently healthy, because they've moved wherever they move to, they take it with them, if you see what I mean. But there is a suggestion that we're looking at blue zones in the UK, and you can check out online the Telegraph and I think some of the tabloids have picked up on this. Next slide, please. Moving on a little bit into entrepreneurship, we've got does age matter in respect um, of entrepreneurs? And there's a mixed literature here, but some literature suggests that people who invest in older entrepreneurs are more likely to see a profitable return. And that leads to the next slide, please. About lifelong learning, that people learn throughout their life, and people should be reskilled, and learning is good in itself. It's a civic benefit, and it doesn't presume the actual form that learning takes. And I'm going to be dipping into the U3A shortly, and we have a look at that. Next slide, please. And so some of you may be familiar with the U3A. Surprisingly enough, many academics are not. Most of my academic colleagues have no idea of the U3A, and the reason is quite simple. It doesn't employ any academics. There are no academic jobs to apply for really at the U3A. It's a peer activity, and it started in '68, and it started in France, in fact, at the University of Toulouse. Then in '81, it started up in Cambridge, and it's a strongly independent organization. I have some association with it, and it's a really interesting. Next slide, please. And so it has a principle. These are the principles of U3A, principles of the fact that you're looking at the third age, an age which is after full-time work, the concept of self-help, and the concept of mutual aid. So some of that might be familiar to those of you who have, for instance, been involved with the cooperative movement. It's got strong affinities, I think, with the cooperative movement. Next slide, please. And you can see the growth there. I'm conscious there are a couple of U3A people here, but and I was trying to get more recent data on the U3A, but roughly around about 2016, it had reached 400,000 numbers, over 1,000 U3As, and recently I'm advised it's flattened and slightly in decline, but it's still pretty impressive. I mean, 400,000 members for a non-profit type organization makes it very large. It's, for instance, larger than I would say the membership of all the political parties put together. It doesn't rival the National Trust, perhaps, but it's certainly up there in membership terms with the biggies. Next one, please. These are the more recent developments. The growth, was affected significantly, I think, by the pandemic, and that led to a drop-off in numbers. And that's partly because the U3A is very much about people coming together and going online, which almost all education had to do during the pandemic, didn't, I think, fit very well with the mantra of the U3A, which was that by and large people came together rather than just associated online. At the moment, the U3A is reviewing its governance and looking to engage more members. So I think that's going to be an interesting organization to watch in terms of positive aging. Next slide, please. If we move on now towards the latter part of this talk, we're looking at the Evergreen life. Andrew Scott of the London Business School had written a book called The 100-Year Life, and then more recently, in the last few months, he published a book called The Longevity Imperative. And he says, as you can see there, there's a need to focus on constructing a society that prepares us for longer lives and ensuring that the quality of life matches its quantity. Next slide, please. And I really like this concept of healthy aging, where he points out that simple duration of life is not as important as healthy life years. It's something we I mentioned earlier. And he uses imagery from literature for four scenarios, one of which I have to say is a familiar one to us nowadays, which is a long but deteriorating life, clinging on to a life which increasingly lacks a quality of life. And I'm sure all of us have seen it through family members or friends, older generation, who have declined and become increasingly um, poor life quality. And that's what he regards as one model of longevity. The second one, though, is the forever young until death. The concept, he describes it a little bit like the Oscar Wilde Dorian Gray image. You're forever young. You are almost afraid of becoming old. You stay young, cling on to youth. Your fear of aging, and you worship youth, and you do is what I would describe as an attempt to cling on to your youthful image and youthful appearance until finally as in Oscar Wilde, all is lost. The third, and there's a huge industry I'm sure you're all aware of around that. But the third one is about slowing down aging. In other words, you slow down the aging process. You recognize that aging happens, but you reduce and delay its impact. And some of the aspects there, which we talked about with blue zones and so on, basically slow down aging and delay and reduce its impact. And there are ways that that can be done. It's not just a matter of drugs, it's also a matter of lifestyles and generally often the way people perceive their aging years, that whether they have a positive view on it. And the final one is reversing aging, turning back the clock. I had a slide which was a Woody Allen slide, which I was on the two minds whether to put in, but it was Woody Allen commenting that in future life he would like to age backwards. He would start off dead and get that over with, and then he would be in an elder care home and be thrown out for being too healthy, and then he would celebrate, have a big party to join work because he was back in the workforce, and then he'd go backwards through life and finally have an irresponsible teenage years and enjoy himself until he disappeared into the womb and had a nice 9 months in a closeted environment. But you can easily find the quote. So next slide, please. Have we got a problem, Lucas? Our slide seems to have stuck. Okay, so the evergreen life, according to Andrew Scott, he says the current way you look at it is you have a life cycle which is education followed by work followed by retirement. It's what you might loosely describe as the gold watch, gold clock syndrome, where you go through those three stages and typically with a cliff edge type retirement. What Andrew Scott posits is this evergreen life where you mix it up a bit. So for instance, you might take gaps out of work early and do the things that you would now do in your retirement, but you do them earlier in your life. You engage in preparation for a longer working life with lifelong learning. You diversify and adapt, and you don't cliff edge, but you recognize that your work will peak and then you downsize gradually and you continue working but for longer. And that's something which I think is a phenomena that some of us are lucky enough to experience. But Andrew Scott suggests this is how it should be. Okay, next slide, please. I think I'm going to probably do the last slides as more informational because I'm conscious of the passage of time, though we did start 10 minutes late. Next slide, please. Okay. This is just suggesting that some of this is happening already. The Centre for Aging Better has pointed out that employment rates of older age groups have improved, and though it was stalled by the pandemic, some of the work that I've looked at has suggested that the post-65 working is increasingly important. And in fact, the highest proportion of post-65 working is in Japan, where I believe 20%, 1 in 5, of all the people over 65 are still gainfully employed. In other words, remuneratively employed. I have a personal beef as a former public sector worker. I think the public sector does very poorly in employment of the over 65s or even over the 75s. When I ask, I ran public management courses for a while, and when I ask people how many people over 65 in your workforce, it's seen as almost a stupid question. No, they're all gone. And so over 75 is not there at all. And so I think the public sector really needs to think carefully about engaging people post-state retirement age. It's a quality employer and it really should be doing more, in my opinion. Next slide, please. And the notion there of redefining retirement, and this is moving away from the cliff edge retirement, but the fact that people continue working. I'm very aware that some people, particularly in the context of WASPy women, feel that they were forced to work longer because of economic circumstances, and I fully acknowledge that. But for many people, work is an important part of their life. It's where they have a lot of friendships, it's where they have a lot of interests and activities, and work can be a very positive way of in having an active aging where you just continue going. But I accept that for some people that's not the case. Next slide, please. I think I've got a poor now. Yep. This is one of the perhaps for people who are employers here, that older workers are the least likely to receive on-the-job training, and the logic behind it is, well, this is a person who's 62, they're going to be gone in a year or two. I'll put the money into an 18-year-old rather than a 60-year-old. But the reality, I think, is that increasingly you're seeing a workforce where older people are still present, and they should be able to access on-the-job training, and it's a win-win. Next slide, please. And this concept of self-employment. I'm self-employed. I file a tax return, and I've got employments that are self-employment as well as part-time academic employment. And self-employment often is a phenomenon there. But again, sometimes that self-employment is not because the person chose it, but because there wasn't an alternative. So they ended up, working from home as self-employed because of lack of alternative. And then next slide, I think we should jump over these, unless we can allow for, Lucas, can we allow for the, yep, I'm conscious. Okay, this one I really like, EasyJet launching an appeal for over 50s cabin crew. I think that's great. And some cabin crew are over 70, wonderful. Next slide. Is it working? Okay, I'll just skip through the slides, Lucas. We'll just go to they'll be there for people to look at. So just walk through the next slides. Active aging is something for people to look at. Next slide. A bit more active aging, very self-explanatory. Stop there. So in conclusion, I think, is the discourse focused on an aging demographic as a problem? Or is an older demographic more likely to have a positive future, create opportunities for healthy lives? Might blue zones have some lessons for us? What changes need to happen within aging demographics and in societal employer attitudes? And possibly might we hope that an older demographic is seen as an asset rather than a liability, as Andrew Scott says, an evergreen life? And how might you yourself change aspects of your life that you might wish to? Can we have the last slide with the follow-up question? There we go. Let's see what how people respond now. Well, I am very happy that I have managed to move the counter from around about, I think it was about 70 up to 85. I'm delighted. Okay, thanks, Lucas. Can you take it back to the slide I mentioned that I'm to go to, and then we can have questions. Thank you.
Alex, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. That was very interesting. I find myself in the target demographic of your talk.
Right.
We've got just 3 or 4 questions. One from Matthew Leach. The ONS has produced an alternative to the dependency ratio that recognizes that modern older people are more productive. This shows that aging is less a challenge than the age dependency ratio suggests, but still
Right.
a challenge. What do you think of that?
I'm not familiar with it in detail, but I do think the dependency ratio is an oversimplified measure. A one-shot measure is always a bit of a problem. And when you talk about dependency ratios, it's typically measured around looking at the number of people in the workforce who are economically active and paying tax, as opposed to the people who are presumed to be non-economically active and receiving the money from the people who are paying the tax. Well, the reality is I'm paying tax. I'm going to continue to pay tax. Even when retired, I'm still taxed. I'm over, my pension takes me over. So even if I didn't do any work, I'm basically pushing back at that dependency simply because I am paying tax on my income. And so that's one aspect. But the other aspect, as the ONS is talking about, is to be more imaginative and open to contributions that people make to society. I was a professor of charities, and older demographics. You only have to go into any charity shop in the high street, and you will see an older demographic supporting both sides of the counter in charity shops. And that is an economic activity, but you don't count the money that the people are not being paid in a charity shop, but it's an economic activity. And so I would applaud the ONS for being more open to working a more nuanced concept of dependency, yes.
We have a couple of comments and questions from Nikki Holzhausen. Nikki did a presentation to the University of Third Age after the global financial
Right.
crisis to explain the cause of this, and they were very interested in detail. And he also comments that he agrees with your comment about cliff edge retirement. Yeah, it's a profound comment. Retirees can be employed to train and mentor younger employees and
Yeah,
share and transfer skills. I don't know if you had anything
right.
to add to that.
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's sad that the examples that are often used about older retirement is what I call the old hackneyed ones of McDonald's and B&Q, where McDonald's and B&Q were employing over 55s. But I think a better example is BMW in Germany,
Yeah.
which is having a problem employing people, and so they adapted the assembly line to deal with older people, who couldn't bend down, and they provided chairs and they provided that. And the other workers in BMW dismissively called it the granddad line or in some cases the Zimmer frame line, until they realized that it was actually more productive than the other assembly lines. The older people were more productive. And then you had younger workers, because they were getting pay incentives, actually wanting to join the older person's assembly line because it was more productive and they would get more money. So I think the concept of writing people off in employment terms when they get older is so wrong. I would say that even if I wasn't older.
I have a question from Jenny Wardle, who's enjoyed the session, as she's sort of retired and still wishes to have a purpose. Can you comment on anything that London is particularly doing for older people?
Ooh, what is London doing for older people? Uh, I would. I'm trying to think of any specific example, and I have to say London probably has a significant proportion of people engaged in a lot of community and social activities. The University of the Third Age is very active in London, and I regard this, and I'm conscious there may be a couple of my colleagues from the University of Third Age, but I think what would be really interesting, and this is a social impact researcher here, saying, well, what effect does active engagement in something like the University of the Third Age have on reducing the costs, for instance, of healthcare? So if you're involved with the University of the Third Age and you, in effect, have an extra 3 years of healthy life before you impact on healthcare costs, then that in itself is a huge benefit. And so I think actively engaging older people in a whole range of activities is useful. By the way, one of the boroughs, and this is when I talked to Michael Manelli some time ago, and I proposed this talk. I'm not sure if it's still true, but some years ago, the borough which had the highest growth rate in elderly people proportionally was the City of London. The City of London had an increased elderly population, older people, particularly around the Barbican. And this is they're not a wide demographic. It's obviously a wealthier demographic, but people were moving into London for a whole range of reasons and moving into the city as retirees and then becoming very active in all kinds of city activities. I don't see it just as around paid employment, but I think paid employment is actually important. There's an old saying, what you pay for, you value. And so I think if an older person is doing something that you would have to pay a younger person to do, then that older person should be valued and paid as well.
I would certainly comment that a number of people at ZN are still currently working into, again, what we'd call the
Mm,
target demographic.
yeah, that's right. But so positively, I look forward to my next years quite positively. I don't intend to stop working. I sail a boat and I'm horrendously seasick, but I regard that as the price to pay.
I would also recommend for those of you that are interested in staying young is to work with youth
Mm,
organizations, voluntary groups like
right,
the Scouts. It is really quite
right.
fun talking to an 8-year-old when you're about 60 years older than them and showing them how
Yeah.
to put up a tent and things. Yeah.
Yes, Kevin, I think you picked up on something I really didn't address there, which is the concept of intergenerational linkages. Um, Family often does it, but as family moves around and changes from, moves into another country and emigrates to Australia or whatever, I think that, yes, so you asked about a scheme. There was a very successful scheme on one charity that I was chair of, which was involved with childcare, and we created what were called foster grandparents.
Mm.
And these were people who were of an older generation, and they basically were supporting. often single-parent families. This is in Southwark and Lambeth, and supporting them, when they were lacking the support of their own particular parents, perhaps because their own parents weren't around or were in another country or wherever. And so this foster grandparent scheme was, in my view, a pretty successful initiative, and it worked quite well.
I have hands up from Brian Lowings and Michael Dury. Do you have questions to ask? Or just approbation?
I'm always good. What I'm happy to do, and I on the slide is my email, and I'm very happy to engage in an email exchange with anyone who wishes to ask. Or I'm particularly interested in learning about other people's views and experiences. So I am a lifelong learner, and I am keen to continue to learn. So please do send if you've got thoughts or ideas, or for that matter as well, if you feel something that I have said is either poorly stated or wrong. And I saw a couple of people put thumbs down to things I said. I would really welcome not just a thumbs down, I would welcome being challenged on something that I might have said that you feel was either inaccurate or poorly put. And so I would welcome that feedback.
Alex, could you tell us your email, or could we see the
Yep.
slide with it on?
Well, I did ask Lucas to put the slide up. It's
Okay,
right
there
at
we
the
go.
beginning.
Right, okay, it's coming.
It's coming. Yeah,
Here we go.
I think
Yeah,
it's the one before
and
that. I think there,
yeah,
and
that's
you
it.
can see
One
there.
one final question. Michael Dury has asked: has the government taken any interest in University of the Third Age?
No, as far
No.
as I'm aware.
Okay, which is very interesting, isn't it? Right. Okay.
Yes, it is.
Alex,
And maybe
thank
they,
you.
maybe they will if we can produce some social impact work that
Okay.
suggests that it has a positive benefit
Yeah.
on health outcomes and so forth.
Alex, thank you very, very much for your time. I think we're coming to the end of our webinar. I believe there are a couple of more interesting ones coming on later this week. Let's grab a
Right.
coffee, the history of London coffee houses. Bridging the gap, client-centric designs and sustainability in the construction industry, and the bright future of cross-border payments. Gosh, that sounds terribly exciting, doesn't it? An exciting time to be part of this transformative journey, and we'll hope to see some more of you at these webinars over the next few weeks. Thank you very much, and thank you, Alex.
And thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining.